Right. Well, I want to thank everyone. I'm Felton Thomas. I'm the chair of the DPLA, and it's great to welcome you all. Wish you all a good afternoon, or sometimes good morning for some of you. We have a great open conversation today, and I'm looking forward to having John introduce the panel for that and me to serve as a moderator on that. As we get started to this conversation, I wanted to take a few minutes to make sure that all of you who are joining us know who the board members are. We're the Digital Public Library of America here. And if they could just, as I introduce them, just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and how long have you been on the board. So let's start with Joe.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Lucia. I'm the Dean of Libraries at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I have been on the board just over a year, I believe. I'm trying to remember my exact start date, but it was, yeah, from 2022 onward.
All right, and Josh.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Fraser-Sparks. I'm a director of culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. That's a mouthful at Walmart. And I've been on the board a little over a year. I'm glad you're here today.
Ms. Lane.
Hi, my name is Elaine Westbrooks. I'm the Carl A. Kroc University Librarian at Cornell University, and I've been on the DPLA board almost 4 years.
And Marcia.
Hello, I'm Marsha Walker McWilliams, Executive Director of the Tulane University History Project, and I've been on the DPLA board for a bit over a year.
All right, well, welcome all. Thank you guys for being with us, and we'll certainly introduce any of the other board members as they join us. I want to welcome you all to this open board meeting here, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. John Bracken, our Executive Director, who will introduce himself and also introduce and set the stage for our panel discussion today.
Thank you, Felton. Thanks everyone for being here. Welcome. I'm going to, because of the august group joining us for this conversation, I'm going to be as brief as possible. I want to first welcome you on behalf of the DPLA staff who are here. Maybe those of you who are here can wave or otherwise, show yourselves. Happy spring, everyone. Happy Easter Monday for those celebrating, especially those of you like Vickery in places where Easter Monday is still a holiday. You're calling in on your holiday day. Without being, I'm not the in-house divinity student. That's another one of our colleagues who went to divinity school. But I will say there is something about spring and the revitalization of spring that this conversation is a little bit emblematic of. To a large degree, the seeds for this conversation started at and in the run-up to the resumed annual meeting that Knight Foundation and that DPLA gets to collaborate, that Knight Foundation convenes every year in Miami in February, which is a rough gig. And I see several of you here who were at that meeting in February. And it really did feel a little bit like coming out of, obviously COVID and all its effects are still with us and we're still processing those lessons. But for me, and each stage is a new stage of development and growth. But this was the first time that community that it's been that Knight Foundation's been of library leaders, that Knight Foundation's been gathering for over 12 years. It was the first time that conversation re-emerged in 3 years. And so this, some of the insights and energy and momentum from that meeting we're trying to capture today. And I want to be clear, I think part of our challenge was, it was such an impactful meeting for those of us who are here, just coming into a conversation saying, well, giving you a report back on the meeting doesn't, for those of you that weren't there, doesn't feel germane. But it does feel like this revitalization, including as DPLA comes up on its 10th anniversary, of who are we, how are we doing on living up to our mission of delivering real, true access? How do we balance, as we were discussing today on our team call, commitments to open access and freedom of information and our commitments to equity and taking on the structural challenges of oppression that so many of our institutions, that all of our institutions were born out of, right? And how do we take that on as a field, and how do we take it on as institutions? And I just realized I just gave a much heavier handoff to this panel than I had intended, because if you could bridge that, you know, these are 500-year-old challenges of modernity and of American democracy. But I guess the last thing I'll say, this is not a drill, right? This is real work that we're taking on as a field, as leaders, as folks who are proactively optimistic about the role of digital technology in bridging the divides in our communities and in serving as tools of justice. And we know it's not a direct path, and we know that there are lots of bumps along the way. And part of the inspiration of the conversations I heard in Miami, and Vickery and Brian and Felton were at this, and Elaine and Jill, who were also there, were at the center of. Part of that conversation really, you know, left me 6 weeks ago with a sense of optimism and excitement about the work going forward. And maybe we'll see how you all feel left after hearing this conversation. I'll come back at the end. I was going to say some events that we've got coming up over the next month or so, but maybe working with Kat, I'll do that at the end. And Felton, I'll hand the con over to you.
All right, well, thanks, John. As you just mentioned, it was a very interesting conversation in Miami with the Knight Foundation. Talked about a lot of challenges that are facing libraries and our users. But as they started to kind of coalesce around like big topics that we really felt that had to be extended, at the heart of that was this issue of access and of, you know, intellectual freedom. And can't, you know, open up a newspaper without seeing some book being banned. Just recently, the one in Florida, a version of Anne Frank being banned from a Florida high school. And the group, the Moms for Liberty, saying that they have a list of 250 more titles that they're getting ready to move forward. And to see that the school had very little resistance in taking the book off the shelf, right? Says that we have a lot of work around access and what we're going to think about. And then when you look at that, you know, we all know that most of those books are books being attacked from the LGBTQIA community or for our BIPOC community. Those are the communities that those books are being banned from. And so, you know, I think as I kind of give a lead off to our panelist here, which is going to be Vickery Bowles from Toronto, who John didn't introduce, right? And Brian Bannon from New York Public Library. I want to start with this quote from Jody Kretzman, who's a professor at Northwestern University, would always kind of push forward. And his comment was, every community is a glass half full and a glass half empty. And he would challenge libraries and librarians to the fact that all of us work in communities, and many folks might look at Toronto or New York in a certain way, but there are always things that are not there, right? There are things that everyone assumes that you have because you're a big library systems, but there are also things that you don't have. And there, for all of us and who work in smaller libraries or those who work in rural libraries, that communities have things that would make them half full, but they also have things that make them half empty. And when books are taken off the shelf, I think we make our communities that much more empty. So as you guys, I've given you guys going to have some time to talk a little bit about the things that you see in your communities. And then we'll come back and I'll ask you some questions based off of the things you say. And then we'll turn it over to our overall larger community to provide questions and comments. So I'm going to start with Vickery, just because I don't want to hear Brian Bannon say anything yet. I want to hold that gold for you, Mr. Bannon. So I will turn it over to Vickery. Vickery, thank you for being with us. Again, Vickery is the executive director and CEO at the Toronto Public Library, and we thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about the important topic of intellectual freedom and equity and what we're all seeing um, across North America in terms of challenges to our intellectual freedom and threats to our democratic values and freedoms. And, fundamentally, there's just a growing intolerance for differences of opinion. And this is really, I think, accelerated over the period of the pandemic. And polarized disagreement has taken the place of respectful and informed discussion and debate. And what's really interesting, I think, too, is it's happening at both ends of the political spectrum. We're seeing it at both the left and the right. And the library, we've always had a role of facilitating and defending democratic values. But I think that our role, our profile and the importance of our role has really increased as a result of the challenges that we're seeing and the divisions we're seeing today. And at TPL, we've really taken a multi-pronged approach to respond to the situation. We see book banning challenges in Toronto and across Canada, but we are also seeing a lot of challenges to programming as well, and drag queen story times, of course, but also other kinds of programs having to do with popular nationalism and other topics that, for whatever reason, people find them offensive or controversial, and they want the program canceled. So we've responded by taking this multi-pronged approach, where we focused on programming, on intellectual freedom and access to information and information literacy and civic engagement, and then also advocacy for both equity and intellectual freedom as mutually reinforcing principles. And I want to talk about that for just a few moments, because I think this is a really important part of the whole issue that we're facing with challenges to intellectual freedom, because it's also challenging equity as well. And so, as we know, public libraries are democratic institutions, and we support democratic values and principles, and equity and intellectual freedom are two of those values. And I think it's really important to make that connection between equity and intellectual freedom, because fundamentally, a commitment to diversity and equity and inclusion means we must protect free expression for all viewpoints, even if some of us or many of us find them offensive. And censorship, it doesn't lead to equity, but intellectual freedom does. And this is why we at Toronto, we created two statements. We created an equity statement and an intellectual freedom statement. And these two statements, they sit above all of our policies, and they guide our work, and they communicate core values that are embedded in all of our work. And I think, Felton, you spoke a moment ago about how the book banning has been targeting the LGBTQ plus and racialized communities. Well, I think that's a really excellent illustration of the connection between intellectual freedom and equity. I mean, it's shocking to see that textbooks are being modified to minimize the role of Rosa Parks as a civil rights crusader, and drag queen story times are being banned, and libraries are being defunded, and people are losing their jobs because they refuse to remove LGBTQ content from their shelves. It's a shocking development that we're seeing in today's world. I don't think, as we entered the 21st century, any of us would have thought this is where we'd be in 2023. But here we are, and I think that the role of the library in defending all of this and positioning ourselves, as we've tried to do with our intellectual freedom and equity statements, as mutually reinforcing statements that reference each other and make each statement stronger. It's really important to take multiple different actions to support our democracies. And recently we had in Toronto, Dr. Richard Obeden, who is we had him as a featured speaker at one of our intellectual freedom series of programs when we were celebrating Freedom to Read Week. And he is the head of the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, and he's the author of a book called Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. And Ovidin, in his program, provided an historical perspective on book banning and censorship. And there was a particular statement that really stood out for people in terms of the connection between equity and intellectual freedom, and what a dangerous time it is that we're living in right now. This isn't just about banning a few books. This isn't just about canceling a few programs. This is a much more fundamental issue that we're all facing. And that quote, to quote Ovidin, he said, "The current wave of book banning in libraries and the broader context of censorship and constraints around the freedom of expression are all stark reminders that the techniques used in Nazi Germany are once again in fashion. Suppressing freedom to read is a core tactic used by those who seek to exercise authoritarian control over our societies. Let's be clear, it's our minds that are the true battlefield, and libraries are a good proxy for those." So we've, as I said, we've really done a lot to try to support the whole concept of intellectual freedom and equity is mutually reinforcing. We've done, also a lot of programming because we really believe that the programming is not just a program on a particular topic or issue. It really is it is to amplify voices of equity deserving groups and celebrating diversity of difference. And we have a non-civil society series that we've launched, where we've told them to get out of their bubble and to come and talk about controversial topics that they may not all be all that comfortable talking about, but it's important to hear other perspectives. We've joined the book sanctuary movement that Chicago Public Library launched recently, and we've declared all of our 100 branches and online spaces as book sanctuaries, and we've selected 50 books that have been banned or challenged in North America. They're adult, teens, and children's books in this book sanctuary collection, and all of these books are available through all of our branches and online. And then we also have a reference collection of that book sanctuary collection at our Toronto Reference Library. And the other thing we've done is because we really want to reinforce the importance of intellectual freedom in the library. And so the Canadian Centre for Free Expression and the Canadian Urban Libraries Council have gotten together, and they've developed an intellectual freedoms training, online training for all public library staff in Canada. And that is being launched soon. And we're really excited about this because I don't know what the situation is in the United States, but in Canada, there is only one university that still teaches intellectual freedom at library school as part of the MLIS program, and none of the others do. And so we're going to teach it because our new hires aren't familiar with the core value of intellectual freedom in a public library. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing in Toronto. We're really concerned about the situation that we're all facing, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on and hearing from Brian as well.
Right. If I can, Brian, if I could just get you to hold 1 sec, because there's something that you spoke to, Vickery, and I'd really like you just to expand on it just for a few minutes here on the 2 statements that you put out as an organization. And
Yes.
what was the kind of overall feedback that you get from your board and your community?
Well, the board passed the statements in December unanimously. They were very, very supportive, and they have expressed they want to become more advocates and have more of an advocacy role in supporting intellectual freedom and equity. We've had overall support for the statements. We did have one counselor challenge us because he wasn't comfortable with the intellectual freedom statement and the fact that we make a commitment to allowing challenging ideas and controversial topics at the library. And he wrote to the library board on that. But that was one person who opposed the intellectual freedom statement. He supported the equity statement, but not the intellectual freedom statement.
Very interesting.
Mhm.
All right, so let me make sure that I get all titles correct. So Vickery is the city librarian at Toronto Public Library. And now we have the Merrill and James Tisch director at the New York Public Library. I will always make sure I introduce you correctly, my friend, Mr. Brian Bannon. And Brian, if you could expand on your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Felton and Vickery. It's wonderful to hear some of the updates about what's happening in Toronto. You have long been one of the great sort of leaders in the urban library spaces globally and certainly in North America. And the work you're doing on intellectual freedom is really exciting. I think maybe it could be a call to action for the field to reintroduce the importance of not just having this in library schools, but bringing it back to our organizations in the field overall. I mean, very similar, I think, to what Vickery has talked about. I think one of the challenges for us in New York City, as we think about the realities of book banning and how those realities impact the lives of New Yorkers, it in some ways reminds me of conversations around climate change 20 years ago, where New York City is a left-leaning city. When we look at the realities of book bans within our own city, we have a really, detailed process for book challenges, but the reality is that we get maybe 3 or 4 challenges per year, and even still, if we end up moving those books off the shelf because the materials are maybe inaccurate or out of date or something like that, they end up moving into our research libraries for the purposes of doing research. So, in many ways, a city like ours, I'll get to drag story hours in a minute. It's a practice more in education and helping the city understand what's happening around our country, but not within our own city. And so in many ways, it's a theoretical challenge to intellectual freedom in our city, as opposed to one that's actually we're on the front lines of in our city. I think, and the reason I like it to climate change is because I think so much of the challenges over the years is for people to really understand what happens when this actually does land on your doorstep. What happens when you are the library that has been taken over by a hostile, essentially group of a politicized group of trustees that mandate policies that essentially erode the core tenets of what makes a public library a public library. By that time, it's not too late for sure, but you're in a very different position than many of our cities around the country and communities around the country in terms of positioning to really, fight back. And when I say fight back, this is really fighting for our democracy, intellectual freedom, the right to read. With the ALA slogan, "Free people read freely," I think is really powerful one, particularly in this moment. And so I think that's the context that we've been really talking a lot about here in New York City, is that what are our responsibilities as it relates to this issue to make it real to our community, our decision makers, policymakers. And so some of the things very similar to Vickery is proactive work that we're doing with our own staff, educational agenda topics with our trustees. We just had a really robust meeting with our board on the issue of banned books and put together a really detailed analysis of what's happening nationally and then how it impacts our city. But we do think that regardless of what the makeup of your city, the politics of your city, this is as Vickery has said, this is an issue that impacts all of us. Whether it's today we're seeing politicians taking books off our shelves. So that's one question I think that is for the whole field to be grappling with, is how do we make this issue real for everyone, regardless of whether or not they're being immediately challenged. Similar to Vickery, in the same vein, we are experiencing for the first time ever protests to drag story hours in our city, and this is the home of the Stonewall riots, which many see as one of the primary moments that led to the gay rights movement here in New York City and nationally, or certainly was an inflection point or a marker of that. This has long been considered a pretty free thinking place to be, and yet we've had upwards of 150 protesters showing up to drag story hours. Some on both sides of this, protesters protesting the protesters, and so it's brought to light questions of safety. It's brought to light questions of safety for our, for our public and our staff. How do we pursue our mission of supporting young child's learning and growth while they feel like they're crossing a picket line in order to have a book read to them. Like, these are very real issues actually that are actually facing our city, and this is all quite new for us in many ways. So on the one hand, the issues of censorship are in theory for us in the city, and on the other hand, we're seeing it in real time on the ground with our story times. Just one of the other things I'd put out there that's been part of this conversation around the important role that our libraries play in our community's democracy is there is sort of this category of, like, as Vickery has talked about, putting materials on our shelves in order to support a broad-based amount of information that represents the knowledge that we have today as a society, and that knowledge is fiction and nonfiction. That knowledge is history. That knowledge is points of views. But trying to have a good cross section of what those ideas represent within our shelves. And there's this sort of one leg of a strong democracy is having access to quality information about our history, about our lives, in order to help make sense of the world that we live in today, and hopefully making a better one in the future. And that is a really core anchoring part of what our public libraries, and really the founding of this country was the premise of it. It's an ideal that is, has been in existence in terms of the modern notion of public libraries since the beginning of public libraries, at least in the United States. There's this other piece of our work around democracy, which is around how do we build trust in ourselves and in our communities and in our decision makers and our policy makers. And the public library also plays a really important part of that. That's, it's our story hours where strangers get to know each other. I just sat in on one this morning, a baby bounce story hour. And in many ways, it's a radical demonstration of democracy. You have strangers that live together in a community, and what they have in common is this little, little brain that's developing, and they're sitting on a mat, doing head, shoulders, knees, and toes, but they're building community. They're building trust. They're building, and it's an institution like the public library that's housing that trust and that building of community. And then there's sort of this third area, which is how do we help people find their voice to actually make change in this world? And the libraries are also playing a role in each of those. And one of the reasons that we've done such powerful work in this area in public libraries in some ways is because we've done it quietly in the backdrop. We've very quietly put knowledge in the hands of people that need it from a broad range of perspectives. We've very quietly built community around ideas and helping strangers get to know each other in their communities and neighborhoods. And we've also helped people get registered to vote so they can have their votes heard in their community. And we've done so as a way that people see us as a trusted, on both sides of the aisle, place to get that done. And that is changing. And to me, that change is it's a scary one in terms of our threats to our democracy. The idea is that that there's active efforts to defund public libraries because they're seen as they're being cast in a very specific light. There's actually this is what we're really here to do. The idea that the knowledge that we put on the shelves so that we can have an informed society is being stripped from the shelves in our cities is really it's beyond an alarm, and it's a crisis moment, I think. And I think the question I have, and I don't know that we've come to any clear solutions here in New York City, is what should we be doing as a field, and what other movements in our own history have we seen as models for how we can be reacting as a field, as a community. I know we don't take this for granted, but I think it's a really important moment. And going back to what Vickery is doing in terms of teaching intellectual freedom, is that libraries exist in our communities for a very specific reason. And in some ways, the fact that we exist today is kind of miraculous. This place that encourages free thinking and open ideas and exchange among people in a community that otherwise wouldn't come into contact except for around their ideas is rooted in this notion of a strong democracy. And with that in mind, how do we remind people of that? How do we live that in a way that protects that, and especially in the face of what we're seeing today? So, I mean, I'd love to open it up for comments and questions, but I think for us as, again, as a city that in some ways is experiencing this in a much less, we're less on the front lines in some ways, and in other ways we are on the front lines, how we can support our colleagues across the country, how we as a field can come together more strategically to really combat some of the challenges that we're seeing. And hopefully, as we find our way out of this moment, are stronger as a result.
Yeah. So Brian, I wanted to just have you expand on something, because in Miami, you did speak to the fact that one of your comments was you don't think that we do enough to just kind of show the facts, to put that as a library, we hold all of these facts, not, opinions. We hold things that we can provide that sometimes we get lost on. If you could just expand on that real quick, because that kind of goes to your last 3 points.
Right. Thank you. So I think when we're thinking about the frame of the role of public libraries in a strong democracy, there's sort of three components that we're at least looking at in New York. One is a place of knowledge and preservation of knowledge and sharing of knowledge, a place of building community around ideas and strengthening relationships and trust in one another and our systems and decision makers, et cetera. And the third is to support action and the role that we play. Now, on the knowledge side, this is probably the oldest and probably the most mature way in which public libraries have supported our democracies, and that's by, representing the broad range of ideas and putting those on our shelves for people to explore and discover. I see Elaine is on the call, and she and I were both on a panel with you, Felton, talking about this. In particular, our research libraries, and New York Public Library is both a public library as well as a giant collecting research library. And our research libraries have a unique, even stronger unique role in sort of this area of supporting knowledge, and that we collect the primary source materials that represent our history. And I think today, especially in the challenges around what is our history, is if we can actually look to the primary source materials. I mean, the letter that Christopher Columbus wrote, when he arrived in America back to England, in quotations, discovering America, that we all probably at some point learned about in not a real accurate way in our childhood. We have at the New York Public Library on display, and and in it talks about the beautiful lands that he found, the wonderful people, and how easy they would be to enslave and subjugate, how they're unarmed. Basically, it was basically a letter to procure more money to come back for another trip, to basically take on enlisting this country as a place to take over. And so to me, like looking at it, in an object like that, in someone's own hand and own words, is a really powerful moment to think about, like, what is our history? And primary source materials are one of the best and most powerful ways of doing that, rather than what did Rosa Parks actually say? What did Martin Luther King Jr. actually say? When we talk about slavery in our country, we actually have dockets that show people listed as property. What does that actually mean? And so if you can take a primary source material and put it in the hands of a child, even a third grader, a fourth grader, a second grader, a 12th grader, and actually have them do sense making around it, it's a really powerful way to teach our own history. And in fact, you're not even really teaching it. You're having people make up their own minds about what our history is, and based on the people that came before us and what they saw and how they experienced it. And so I do think that's a really critical part of the role that libraries have played historically in a very quiet way, especially our research libraries and our public libraries as well. And it's a really critical role in the day that we are, now, where questions around facts and truth are called into question, that we actually have a really powerful role to play, in that conversation.
So I'm going to build off of something you spoke to, but also, Vickery, something that you brought up around the whole concept of intellectual freedom, and the fact that folks aren't learning it necessarily in library schools any longer. And the commitment to it, I think, has been somewhat lost from when I became a librarian 25 years ago. So that I'm not sure our staff are ready to be the fighters for civil rights, right? I mean, they're being put on the front lines of what might end up being one day, like as Brian said, picket lines that they have to cross to get onto one side, to be on this side of something that they may not either agree with or that they don't really understand because they haven't been taught, right? They've come to library land in a different way, and thus they're not sure where they stand on things, and there's work that needs to be done from a library standpoint. What do you guys think that the overall profession can do to make sure our staff are better prepared for where we may be going?
Well, yeah, I certainly, library schools, I think, need to be teaching intellectual freedom. And, I will say that, our staff are very committed often, and to social justice.
Mhm.
And they understand social justice, I would say generally. But people struggle when there's, we had in Toronto a controversial speaker who was a part of a radical feminist group. And there was a whole discussion about people who are transgender and their rights and the rights of radical feminists or feminists. It was very controversial, and there were calls for us to cancel the program. It was a third-party booking. It wasn't our program, but it really brought into focus the whole issue of social justice versus intellectual freedom. And I said repeatedly, of course, that when I stand up for intellectual freedom, I'm standing up for social justice. I'm standing up for equity deserving groups. I'm making sure their voices don't get shut down, because they are the ones who are most likely to be shut down. And that we have to, that intellectual freedom leads to equity. Censorship doesn't. So but there wasn't a whole, I think that, it's intellectual freedom is complex. Democracy is complex, and it's messy and it's difficult, and you have to be engaged, and you have to be involved. And so many times, there's low voter turnout, and there, all sorts of issues indicating that people aren't engaged in their democracy. And people need to be. We need to re-engage people. I mean, civic engagement is really an important part of what we need to be doing in libraries, and teaching people about democracy as well.
So Brian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo Vickery's and add, I think on this topic, we as a field need to basically brush off our our old textbooks and re-engage in this conversation. And I think re-engage on a number of different fronts. The first is there are very active mobilized groups in the US and Canada that are looking at democracy and have been for some time, and through the lenses of civic, action and participation, getting out the vote. There's a really mature ecosystem in both countries that are looking at this in a variety of ways. There are policy groups that are looking at how to strengthen and secure our democracies. But where I would say there's a real opportunity for libraries is that, at least when we've looked at this deeply in the United States, some of the biggest players in this arena, libraries are not really at the table, or really, I mean, if you look at the last couple of big policy briefs that even come out on this topic in the US, libraries aren't even mentioned, and which I think is fascinating and troubling. So I think that there's some work that as a field, we can do that with ALA, we can do that with DPLA, we can do that with the Public Library Association and Urban Libraries Council, and we as library leaders and directors, we can do that as well. We can find out, we sort of re-educate ourselves on who's leading this work in our own communities and who's leading this work nationally, and kind of sharp elbow our way back to the table. And it's not a very sharp elbow. Once you kind of remind people, it reminds me a bit of sort of like the way the Gates Foundation initially looked at U.S. libraries as a no-brainer for bridging the digital divide, where it's like, my gosh, there's 16,000 public libraries in the United States, and they're all in every neighborhood, and God, we just got to give them some computers and we can get people online. It's actually not a very sharp elbow kind of thing. So I think there's one category of just reminding people who we are, what we represent, and our positioning around democracy, so we can get back at the table, because these are allies. These are allies in our fight on this front. These are folks with potential that have resources. There's a way to kind of to strengthen ourselves by being back at some of those tables. I think on a similar front, very locally, is in the same way that we need to re-educate probably our fellow library professionals in our organization. There has been a shift in the library field, not only in library schools, but within public libraries, and New York Public being one of them, is that I think for good reason, there's been shifts in where the requirement of the library science degree is for certain jobs. So in New York Public, for example, a branch manager of a neighborhood library is not required to be a librarian. In fact, a number of years we made this shift in part because our branch managers are really, part of the community, part of the neighborhood, and they may or may not have the credential, but we're trying to find the right leader for that neighborhood and community. And so we have many classifications, I think, certainly within US libraries, that are front-facing library personnel who are doing fantastic work for all age groups that may not have gone to library school. And so there's a real, I think, importance for us to spend time re-educating, maybe in some cases educating for the first time, some of these basics with our own staff and teams. And Vickery, I would love to get your curriculum to New York. And another thing is how do we begin to educate our governing and policymaking bodies? And in New York City, we're a private institution, and so that primarily for us has focuses on our trustees. We've got roughly 60 people on our board. Many of them, again, are super philanthropic, and their involvement in the library is, comes out of goodwill, but they don't necessarily have a strong grounding in this work either. And so spending time in trustee meetings and getting people to really understand the nuance, and it probably takes a few bites at this apple to really kind of get, well-intentioned library trustees fully understanding how deeply this cascades into so much of our work. And then, of course, there's also the intimate relationship many of us have with our elected officials within our own city. And so for us in New York, that's our 50-member city council and our mayor, and re-engaging around this. And so I think where we could also use support from places like DPLA, and thank you, John and Felton, for hosting this conversation today, or again, our associations, is preparing us as library leaders or helping us as library leaders, just make it easier for us to do that, how we can share information around on re-onboarding our teams, working with our trustees, working with electeds. And we've done this work before. There's lots of great examples, but I think in many instances, what we just need to do is dust off some of the work that we've done in the past, make it, update it with more, relevant examples from the, the times that we're living in now, and bring this back to the table for our communities. And but I think we need a community action plan for library leaders, and perhaps DPLA is helping do that by hosting this discussion.
Well, that's going to be my last question, but before I do that, I want to make sure that everybody knows if they want a question or the comment that they want to put it in the Q&A, or and we will ask this after I bring on John Bracken, if you would join us when you get a chance. But while John is joining us, for Vickery and Brian, so you didn't know I was going to bring you on, did you there, John? That's how I roll here. But Vickery and Brian, I just wanted to ask you, this seems different, right? I mean, you have the Moms for Liberty who have a lot of money now, right? All of these groups that are challenging us are being funneled money, and they're not going away, right? They have lists of 250 books that they want to challenge and all of these type of things. And we seem to be lost on like how we're going to fight this, right? I mean, city by city, everybody is figuring it out. But like, what are we doing as a whole to figure out how we get people who are funders to come together on behalf of the overall, concepts of intellectual freedom, or just libraries in general? No one seems to have that in place. So I just want to ask that of Vickery and Brian. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think our associations really need to provide leadership here. Certainly, I think as large library systems like New York and Toronto, we certainly have responsibilities too. But I think that our associations, and we need to work with our associations. And I think, I think ALA, ULC, for instance, have got groups working on this. I'm on a group with ULC on Democracy in Action, and we're working together to develop initiatives. And ULC has a declaration of democracy that many library systems have signed on to. So I do think our associations, and in Canada, the Canadian Urban Libraries Council is doing similar work. They're the ones that are leading the intellectual freedom training for all public library staff, so I do think there is work that's being done, but as you say, Felton, the people who are opposing intellectual freedom are well funded, and they're very coordinated, and it's become very political. It's been politicized, and so that state legislatures are taking action to ban books and ban programs, and so anyway, it's a dangerous time for democracy.
Any thoughts, Brian? Vickery said it very well, but I just.
Yeah, I think Vickery said it. I think only one other thing, I don't quite know how this fits into the conversation, but I think it's worth noting that censorship has become even easier than it has historically. That there is the act of taking materials off the shelves, but there was just a fantastic article in the Times last week that talks about digital books that you bought being altered before your very eyes. And I think it's important to remember that we now license and ebooks, and this is for textbooks as well as for pleasure reading. And we don't own those copies of those books, the publishers do. And if they decide to make a change, which this has been happening for some time, in the makeup, if they decide they want to censor or move around topics within books, they can do so really without alerting anyone. And so the political winds in a given community can shift, and so can the content of materials without anyone knowing. And I think this is also, I think it's such an important time for us to be looking at this and thinking about what are the policies that we should be looking at beyond just preventing the wind of taking materials off our shelves. How should we be working with our publishers? And Vickery, you said this earlier, and I want to underscore it, that one way to censor and to ban books is also by defunding our libraries. And if we can't buy books, we can't put them on the shelves. And so continuing to advocate for how we secure and keep well-funded libraries in our communities is another part of this. But yeah, nothing more beyond that to add.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think the point you just made, Brian, about ebooks and the licensing challenges that we have with ebooks and other e-content is huge, and it's just another component of the challenges we're facing with intellectual freedom.
And to that point, that's why I bring on Mr. Bracken, because while we've been talking about the book, and we haven't really examined how this kind of interacts with digital collections, and how the intellectual freedom and the equity issues facing the digital. I wanted to make sure for folks who are coming to the DPLA meeting had an opportunity to hear how DPLA sees this work.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is, first, thank you, Vickery and Brian. And I think putting myself in the shoes of some of our partners who work out, especially, one of the lovely things about DPLA, the A part of DPLA, is we work with folks across the country. And in just scanning through the attendee list, I see, without naming anyone for obvious reasons with this, I see two people who, when I reached out to get a sense of, hey, how are you guys dealing with censorship? What are these attacks feeling like for you as leaders, who picked up the phone and called me and said, I can't talk to you about this on email right now. The level of political pressure right now and what we're anticipating coming from the legislature. And these are two folks who, I'm looking at both of you virtually, are, I know from a personal level, committed to this work in intense ways. And actually, now that I think about who's here, it's three of you. And so I guess one of the things as we think about our work, both on the archival work and a lot of the work we've been trying to do around ebooks and with some of our partners, lyricists that are here, is how do we make sure that we're grounded in the reality of folks across the country, and how are we, practicing, as my colleague Tracy Hall says, radical empathy with the folks who are in Montana and in Texas and are facing existential and physical threats, right? In a way that we all do, but in a much deeper way, I think, in a lot of those geographic centers. And I don't have an answer for that other than that we're listening, and through the good work of Kat and others who are here, we've convened conversations and tried to do that work. So I think it's a fraught moment, and how do we bridge between those of us, as Brian said, are privileged to be in a space where we have some combination of political leaders and citizenry and voters and funders who really have our back, and folks who we know are in a much different context, and how do we serve everyone? I don't have an answer for that, but that's what we're working through. And that gets close to the plug, a conversation we're doing here in Chicago with Tracy Hall from ALA and Chris Brown from Chicago Public Library, exploring that from a Chicago context. So I don't know if I dodged your question, Felton, but maybe to some degree, it's also a tee up for any folks, who are like, cool story, New York, and, the two of the most elite forward-thinking cities on the planet. I don't know if there are other folks who want it. So, and Michael Blackwell just came in with a very nice practical lesson of things folks can do.
Well, we have 3 questions, and we want to make sure with 8 minutes that we get to them. And the first is from, it's Don Cobbin, and she says, in teaching intellectual freedom at Toronto, are the students able to get credit for it as an independent study?
Well, it hasn't been launched yet. It's being launched next month and it's not our program, it's the Canadian Urban Libraries Council and the Centre for Free Expression. So it's for all public library staff across Canada. Our staff will be making it available to them online through our learning site. But in any case, it's I haven't heard of any plans that there's any credit associated with it, but we are talking about making it a mandatory training for our staff at TPL.
Vickery, can I just ask a follow-up to that? So this is a
Yes.
national initiative in
Yes.
Canada to, we should definitely talk offline. This seems like something that the US we should just work with our library leaders here and crib from what you created in Canada.
Yeah, well, Brooks Rainwater at ULC has contacted.
He's already all over it. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
yes, yeah.
Great.
Good. Now that's very smart, very smart. So we have a question from Lisa Guernsey. This is such an important conversation. Thank you. I'm wondering how libraries can navigate the parents' rights piece of this, in which it's about parents saying they don't want their own children coming across particular books in the library. This child versus adult distinction seems like a pernicious, but unfortunately effective way to divide people, and would love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it, especially in communities that are having to come up with real solutions to sort of the political rhetoric, it's true. Like, we have to figure this out as a library. I'll say in New York, we have a bunch of library card types. This is in some of the cities I've worked, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, it's varied. But in New York, our library card types include a juvenile card for children under 12 and under. And a parent can opt for their child to have a juvenile card. And what that means is it limits certain materials from being able to be checked out that are, basically, now it doesn't keep Heather Has Two Mommies out of the hands of a 12-year-old or an 8-year-old. But what it does is it designates materials that are intended for older audiences, and those are not able to be checked out on the juvenile card. I think there are lots of creative solutions that libraries have come up with to balance this. There's not an art. I mean, this is an art. It's not a science. But I do think that this is a very practical question that we need to, as a field, do a better job of supporting our colleagues and how to thread that needle. Because I don't think it has to be like everybody gets everything. It really is. We can work with parents to make this a collaborative effort.
Yeah. In Toronto, we have juvenile cards, but people, we're clear that children have access to everything in the library, so there's no
They
restriction.
can browse, right?
They can browse and they can borrow anything, to be honest. But our material selection policy for our collections specifically identifies that parents and guardians have the responsibility for what their children borrow. And just like anyone else, you can choose to borrow something, you can choose not to borrow something, you can and you can but you can't make those choices for other people. Same with the drag queen story times. They're really popular. And lots of parents bring their children to drag queen story times, and it's a fun, joyful event. But if you don't want your children to go to a drag queen story, well, then that's fine. Don't bring them to that. So it's a choice, and parents and guardians, and so parents we're not interfering with parents' rights. They can choose what their children can and cannot borrow. But like anything else in society, your children are going to be exposed to all sorts of things, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on television, where it's in the schoolyard. There's all sorts of things children are going to be exposed to, and parents have a responsibility for curating what their children borrow from the library, and how they use the library, what programs they go to. No one is challenging parents' rights in that regard, but they don't have a right to take content and programming away from other children just because they don't believe it's right for their children.
Great. So we have one last question, which I think leads into John Bracken's last final words for us. But I will offer this question for both of you. What do you consider the starting place for public library foundations and friends to support this national level advocacy for intellectual freedom?
Well, our foundation has really engaged with the whole issue of intellectual freedom and programming on democratic issues and democracy. And in fact, they have a number of donors really interested in wanting to fund programming at the library. And in fact, Dr. Oviden, who came from the UK for our program, was funded by our foundation to come over. So it's wonderful that our foundation leaders are taking this out to the donor field, and they're getting a lot of traction and a lot of interest. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here to get support from many in the community who also see the same challenges that we're seeing, and they understand better the role of the public library, and they want to fund us to do more.
Yeah, we're seeing exactly the same thing here in New York City, that many of our legacy funders are very interested in the work that we're doing around civics and democracy, especially if we're translating it to them in a language that they're more familiar with. I think this is a little bit of tweaking that we need to do as a field to better articulate the fundamental role that we play in this arena. But this is a hot topic right now, and I think funders want to be part of the solution. So very, very similar. We're seeing in New York funders coming to us, new funders even, around this issue. I also would say, I don't know if Canadian libraries are part of this effort, but John Award at the Seattle Public Library has recently formed a group that brings together Library Foundation leaders for the first time. And I think it's a wonderful example, this group, of a place to bring these types of issues. I mean, I know they have an annual conference, and so this would be a great topic. I would encourage, well, maybe I'll reach out to John unless she's already on the call. Like, this would be a great topic to bring to our—
Jonna, the mic is yours. That was the perfect tee up for
Yes.
Austin. Are you there? Do you want to plug Austin, Jonna? And any other big announcements you might want to share that may be ready to go? The Jonna
she says I'm here, everyone from Seattle.
May turn her mic. If she doesn't turn her mic on, maybe Jonna, or if not, I will find the link to the June event that Brian just shouted out that's happening in Austin. And I think—
Oh, it's in Austin, yes.
So we'll put that link in. Yes, do it. And Tom Fay is here too, plugging it. Look at that. Seattle full press. Felton, I'm just taking over the mic and I'll bring it in for a landing until
Yes,
we get this.
Donna can't
I'm
turn
gonna-
her, but we do want
Oh.
everyone to go to this conference, Austin. I think it's June 11th through the 13th.
Hi, y'all.
Have an
Yeah.
opportunity to join
Oh,
us.
there we go.
Hey,
Oh,
Donna.
thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking I can't turn that on. Oh, what lovely plugs for both. Just the fact you're thinking about your funding partners through the library foundations and friends. And, it is our role to protect and advance our libraries, and not just our libraries, all of our libraries. And so I think that there's some momentum building within the funding community. I also think that the case for support, when you start to bring in democracy and libraries' role in protecting in democracy, becomes maybe one of our more powerful things we've ever really had a chance to talk about. And we're not going to miss this opportunity. So the couple things. First off, the conference is in Austin, June 11th through the 13th. First time back in person, but this will be our 7th one. And what's really lovely is we're seeing some of the bigger organizations sending more people this year. And I think we're going to have some really meaningful conversations. But before the conference, those of us who have been funding the Library Support Network, which is basically this online community where we're sharing tools and supporting one another, that group of us are getting together to really start to dig into what other collective work can we tackle. And one of the things that continues to bubble up to the surface, and Brenda, who I think is here from Chicago, is definitely the energy behind this. But it's really talking about how do we develop our voice and our case for support that really can be used beneficially at a local level, but benefits us on a national level. Because so much of what libraries are around local and hyper local, that's what makes your work amazing, but it also makes us very weak and susceptible. And so I think that the opportunity to kind of elevate this whole conversation, the funding partners are showing up, and we're going to help do it and do it in partnership with the library ecosystem. So thank you for the plug, and come to Austin. It'd be great. I'll drop the link into the web address here too. Okay, thanks all.
Thank you. All right, well, John, if you don't have anything else.
Hey, the only things I will say is thank you all. Thank you, DPLA board, for being here. Thank you, DPLA board emeritus members like, uh-oh, did I just freeze? No, Brian froze for a second. You just weren't moving. Brian Bannon and Bob Darton, one of DPLA's founders, here today. And I want to do a special thanks to everyone active at the DPLA level, especially the DPLA working groups. And that is my bridge and tee up to Kat to plug the next coffee chat we're going to have in about 2.5 weeks with our newest DPLA working group, the Wikimedia working group. There we go. There's the link for that. So that is the end of my plug. Thank you all so much. That was incredibly rich. And see you in Chicago for ALA Annual if we don't see you in Austin before that.
And we certainly want to thank Vickery and Brian. What a wonderful conversation. You guys were just, very thoughtful as always. So very much appreciate it. As much as
Thank you,
I
Felton.
hate giving you any kind of credit for what you do, Mr. Bannon, that was outstanding. Vickery, you're always amazing. So we just leave it at that.
Anyway,
All right, everybody.
thanks
you so
very
much.
much. Nice to see you, Brian.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all so
Bye.
much. This is our
Nice
first
to see you all.
international. This is our first international open board meeting, by the way. Thank you, Vickery.
Okay, thank
Oh,
you. Thanks,
thanks.
everyone.